My name is Crystal Fletcher, and welcome to All About Books. I love books, and I'm fascinated with what inspires authors to write their novels. So that's what I do on All About Books. I interview authors to find out. Today, I am thrilled to have critically acclaimed novelist, screenwriter, TV documentarian Paul Butler with me. Paul has published 12 books. His latest, Mina's Child, is published by Inanna Publications. And just to give you a little taste about what Mina's Child is about, here we go. Mina's Child imagines a second generation springing from the heroes in Bram Stoker's Dracula. In 1921, Mina and Jonathan Harkner's daughter, Abri, a student at King's College London, starts to question the extraordinary adventures her parents claim to have experienced in England and the Carpathians. And my absolute favorite review is by Leslie Vryenhoek, and she says, Paul Butler has turned the Dracula myth inside out. So Paul, welcome to All About Books.
Thank you, Crystal.
I'm thrilled to have you today. And I was wondering if we could start things off. If you could tell us, Paul, when you first became acquainted with Dracula.
Well, I think that would be a book I read in my teenage years. I think I became caught up in the excitement of the story because it's a story that has an enormous amount of momentum in it, particularly the early parts of it. And it's quite it's a scattered narrative in the sense that there's many different points of view that come through people's journals and the letters and all this stuff that's put into chronological order to create a story. Bram Stoker was drawing from the kind of approach that had been used decades before by Wilkie Collins, who wrote The Woman in White and The Moonstone. And what he was doing, and what Wilkie Collins did very well, was to create this sense of urgent narrative and mystery. And I think Dracula does the same thing, but in a much more obviously supernatural fashion. So, I mean, I love the sense of abandonment in Dracula, and I found that irresistible. I was drawn in by the film versions as well, the various ones through the years. So, yeah, it's very much part of my background. This idea of the job of the supernatural author is to make something so convincing you can convince the reader that the impossible is real. And I think I admire anyone who tries to do that because it's a very high bar to get to. Yeah.
That's right.
Yes.
Now, there's been numerous, I believe I saw the number around 200 different remakes of Dracula. And you had mentioned that you were a fan of various films. Now, which was your favorite version, Paul?
My goodness, it's so hard because there's just so many of them, and it depends on your mood. The Murnau Nosferatu ages extremely well. That was done in the early 1920s, 1922, and the film company Piranha Films. What they did is they hid the fact that it was Dracula because Bram Stoker's widow was still alive, and they would have to pay royalties and acquire the property if they were to make the film under the name Dracula. So they disguised it and they changed people's names, they changed the settings, they made it earlier, and they made it a German film. They brought it down 50 years earlier than the Dracula is set. which is said more or less contemporary with when it was published. Um, so but it's a very poetic and disturbing film with lots of nightmarish imagery. And the then you get the Bela Lugosi Universal Pictures Dracula, that tends to be, it looks rather stagey and staged by comparison, because they were grappling with sound for the first time, which meant you tended to get a lot of actors standing around close to microphones. So it looks a little bit like a chamber drama, a lot of it, but some of it still has a lot of works very well. And and then the next major phase was the Hammer Films versions of Dracula and its various sequels. And that was more or less a series of films, all related to each other, with Christopher Lee in the title role. And they have a garish, vigorous quality to them that that can fit your mood perfectly. And then it was various. There's so many of them. There's too many. There's the closest to being Stoker's story, was a version that the BBC did in the mid to late 1970s, with Louis Jourdan in the title role. And that was different because it actually it got rid of one of the characters, one of the major main characters. But other than that, it tried to be as faithful to Stoker as possible. And it ended up in some ways, because it was so faithful to Stoker, the ending of Dracula is a bit rushed, the novel, and the ending of the BBC presentation, because they're brief, really, when they did literary presentations, supposed to be as close to the novel as they could get. So they ended up replicating the flaws as well as the strengths. I think the ending is a curious ending, because it ends with a kind of a gunfight, which is not really, it kind of diminishes Dracula as a supernatural being, because he's kind of sidelined.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, so it's interesting anyway, but there's so many of them. And the curious thing, and the thing that really drew me to it and made me think, well, here's the thing that I can't let go. And the Francis Ford Coppola movie version gets this, half gets it, is that the women figures in Dracula are sexualized by Dracula. They're these incredibly prim figures who are not real people at all, who become real people. But what the Coppola film got was the sexual liberation part of it. But what it missed out, that is definitely in Dracula, as uncomfortable as it is this band of brothers who are hunting Dracula, the Jonathan Harker, Arthur Holmwood, the aristocrat, Dr. Stewart, and Van Helsing, and Quincy Morris. These people are united in being absolutely repulsed by this sexualized version of women. The idea of these women who are breaking out. There's one line in particular that strikes you in this day and age as being really odd. And part of Dr. Stewart's narrative, part of his journal, he sees Lucy Westenra, who's the first woman character to be vampirized by Dracula in England. He sees her voluptuous power and comes out with this extraordinary line where he would gladly kill her with, exact words are, I can't remember, but it's like delight. He talks about how he would be delighted and go about it with it's such a striking line. I've forgotten what it is because it's so big. But the idea, and then there's this in the vault, they hunt Lucy down to this vault, and then they stake her, and there is this, it would seem by today's standards, it seems very, very disturbingly misogynistic, because when they're staking Lucy, they're saying prayers, and they're talking about how high duty shines on the shines about Arthur, who's staking his fiancée. It's really, really odd. But
Yeah.
it doesn't age in the way that I think Stoker probably intended it to age, or if he thought about that at all, because we're reading from it. We're seeing it kind of like an incel um, fulfillment of desire and destruction at the same time, and revulsion from sexuality while at the same time desiring sexuality. It's almost a mirror held up to a late Victorian sensibility about sex from a male point of view, that is extremely uncomfortable. And of course, with Mina's Child, if you push it ahead even one generation, children of the very people who were involved in this, the children would be thinking quite differently, because this would be after the suffragette movement would have been in,
Right.
full swing,
Yeah.
about to get exactly what it was after. The war would have questioned everything that people felt about class and patriarchy and following orders and believing what we were told and believing the public school, which in England means private school, ethos about valor and honor and all those things.
Hmm.
And you push it ahead just one generation to the early 1920s, which is what I'm trying to do.
Right.
Um, then suddenly all these things that might have been unquestioned um, suddenly look quite different. And that's really what I'm trying to do with Mina's Child.
And you certainly did. But like what kicked that off for you? Was it just all of this continually questioning that you had? Is that what inspired you to start Mina's Child from such a different angle, or?
Um, yeah, well, I, I mean, I love. I guess what it is yes. I mean, you're part of you, well, rather like part of you loves an original piece of work, and you keep coming back to it because there's something that disturbs you about it, and you want to
Mm-hmm.
revisit it and relive it and change it. But the moral axis has changed by the time something was written from when you're reading it. So, and you're seeing all kinds of hidden things in it. And in case of Dracula, if you read it all the way through now, it's not even particularly well hidden. Some of the things that would strike you as being very much at odds with modern values, particularly about women. And I think there's a lot of confusion about it, because when well, the Coppola film that a lot of people have seen, um, they present the female characters as being way more liberated than they are in Stoker's from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like Lucy in particular is about extreme contrasts. She is this twittery, childlike character, straight from a Victorian man's imagination, an ideal doll-like figure who one of her suitors, Quincy Morris, actually keeps repeatedly calling her little girl as he's proposing to her and talking about how tiny her hands are and all that.
Yeah.
And so that's creating so that when she comes back as this bloodthirsty, voluptuous thing, you've got this wildest of contrasts. And I think that tells, I mean, I think what brought me to it is the fact that we haven't really left those times behind. The fact that you can really look at the the modern. We think we're past that, and we're not as a society, not as a whole. And I think that's the thing. It was considered as I read through all the contemporary reviews of Dracula at the time it was written, and there are criticisms about it as well as praise. But no one picks up in 1897. No one picked up on the misogyny. Nobody did. I think the reason why we don't today is because we're more used to the filmic versions that kind of find some way of smoothing that over.
Right.
So, but the thing is, if you look at that, it's not even very long ago. 1897, in societal terms, is not long ago. It was the last breath of Victorian society. It was, and to put it into perspective, that H.G. Wells's classic, The Time Machine, which critiques the class system through the hubristic Morlocks, the working class and what they'll become, and the Eloi, the aristocrats who are fed, that thing was actually released 2 years before Dracula. And, and to think about how late Dracula was in the Gothic cycle, it was very late, and yet, and yet it was not commented upon. Some of these views were kind of odd.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Now, Paul, as a fan of the original 1897 Dracula, Bram Stoker's, what elements of that were important that you included in your version? Like, you did a lot of changing, but what elements were important that you did maintain in your new version?
Well, I was interested in the relationship between the men, the way that the way that the Van Helsing character is like a housemaster or a headmaster in a public school system. Like, he is like someone who they all start to defer to because of his brilliance and because of his certainty, perceived brilliance and certainty. And it was I wanted to create this band of brothers gone wrong. So it was partly the fact that these people had trusted each other so much at one time, because that's part of their culture. And then a generation on, they find that they're terrified of each other. When Jonathan Harker knocks on Arthur Holmwood's door, this is something. Oh no, it's kind of like
Yeah.
there's revisiting of the past because they've got a lot to hide. A lot of,
Yes.
and I wanted I think there's the one scene which has changed that I changed the scene that happens in the vault with Lucy that I've already talked about in the novel. I've just changed the venue. The venue is they're still standing around the bed. They're still taking out the stake and the hammer, but she's not actually dead. She's so it's. But then again, there's two physicians there. Death certificates are not going to be a problem, So there's that. I'm just revisiting and the question really is, what if all of this is the same? You change one fact. The one fact that you change is that Lucy is not dead when is not undead. Of course, there's no such thing. But what if she's not when she's dead? How does that change the story? That would be the major draw.
Mm-hmm.
If you take one little thing, what is the story about? It's a story about how everything revolves around this certainty given to us by Van Helsing that she is not, she may be walking, talking, she may recognize her fiance, she may speak, but she's not actually alive, so you don't have to worry about what you do with her. If you change that, then the whole story collapses and it becomes
Right. Paul, I was hoping that you could read for us today. And before you start, can you just tell us why you've chosen this particular passage?
Well, I'm going to choose this particular passage, and it's a cowardly thing to do because it's from the early part of the novel. But it means that by reading from the early part of the novel, there's not a ton of explanation. I'll just give you what has happened, which is that middle-aged Jonathan Harker screams in the night because the name Quincy. Quincy was the name of Quincy Morris, who's one of the band of brothers who dies during Dracula's the final showdown with Dracula. But he's also the name of Jonathan and Mina Harker's son, who they name after this Texan hero that was part of them. And Abri is the younger sister of the late Quincy Harker. So she is thinking about, she's heard her father screaming in the night, he's woken her up. Her mother has placated Jonathan, but Abri is then led to think about her brother and how her brother's death in the First World War has affected her. And so we're musing from Abri's point of view. Abri switched the lamp back on and threw off the bedclothes again. The weight of sleep hadn't left her, but she felt too rootless not to move, like a limb searching for its body. She slipped out of bed as quietly as she could and padded slowly to the curtains, pulling the lapels of her nightdress close around her neck with one hand and reaching to tug an opening in the curtains with the other. She gazed into the pre-dawn Belgrade Square with its contours of mysterious foliage and its dark walls of houses some 200 yards opposite, beyond the gardens. As she watched, a yellow light came on in an attic window. The servant must have awoken in a house just like her own. Dawn couldn't be far away. She looked into the gardens, a sea of undulating leaves, small birds hurtling like grenades from one branch to another, preparing for the day. Moonlight touched the iron teeth of the fencing. Someone, a lone watcher, sat on one of the benches. A young man is seen from his outline. He appeared to be gazing at the Harker's own house or at some point very close to it. Abri could just make out the outline of his suit, the paleness of his hands and face. Whatever it was seemed quite motionless, almost as though in a trance. She moved away quickly and let the curtain drop. A bedside lamp was on. She could be seen. She listened in the darkness, not yet ready to return to bed. Though the tall beech at the front of the house was not visible from where she was, the sound of leaves grew like a stream as the breeze picked up strength. She had climbed this tree once to this level, thinking mistakenly she could reach Quincy's room, now her own, and surprise him. But she'd had to shimmy down again and admit failure as the trunk did not come close enough. Everything came back to Quincy, as much for her as for her parents. Even with 8 years between them, they had always been playmates of a kind. They had appeared in the Christmas pageant together when she was young. He had let her beat him at chess. When she grew older, she, naturally athletic, could beat him at tennis, even when he was trying. It could have been that his reflexes were slow, or it might have been the result of a physical anomaly. He had webbed toes. But Quincy was not adept at games. He was always happy to play them with her, however. Losing gracefully was part of his character. She moved back to her bed, more restless than ever, and switched off the lamp. Tomorrow she'd have duties. She had said she would go to tea at Lyons with her mother in the morning. In the afternoon, she would meet her tutor, Professor Reynolds, and talk over her dissertation. He'd winced when she'd mentioned her working title, From Keats to Whitman, Mystic Premonitions. She'd wondered then whether it was all really her, or whether she'd chosen this approach and this subject to fulfill the ambitions of another. Who could that other be but Quincy? Quincy had loved Ode to a Nightingale and become emotional when he talked of Whitman. It occurred to her that when she was trying to carve herself into a living memorial to her brother. How mighty are the dead.
Wow. Thank you. So for all of our listeners, what I will do is I'll put links on the bottom to Paul's website where you can learn more about Paul and also purchase a copy of Mina's Child. But before we go, Paul, I'd love for you to share with us what you're working on next.
Well, here's what I'm working on now. As you can see, and I admire writers who directly try to harness the supernatural. And this is actually what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to write a modern ghost story. Um, uh, it's something that I've been skirting around the Gothic and the supernatural for many, many years. For the first time, I'm actually trying to do what I think is the duty of someone who really thinks that way about supernatural fiction, which is that it's a difficult thing to do because you have to persuade the reader that something that can't be real is real. But I'm trying to do that. I'm trying to write a modern ghost novel. Ghost stories are typically, there are more ghost stories than ghost novels because a ghost novel requires you believe in the characters and the situations for 70, 100,000 words, whereas a ghost story is in and out before the reader gets suspicious.
Well,
So,
I am intrigued, Paul. I'm definitely intrigued.
well, thank you, Crystal. I appreciate it.
Well, and thank you so much for agreeing to come on to All About Books. Really enjoyed your reading and learning more about you and Mina's Child. And for everyone else there, please like my video and please subscribe to All About Books. Thank you for listening.